With us right here in the studio, Israeli Reserve Brigadier General Relik Shafir, the former commander of the Tel Nof Air Force Base in Israel, and in Moscow, New York Times journalist Ivan Nechepurenko. Ivan, let me start with you in Moscow. We just heard some of those questions being posed. It seems like throughout what has been about 200 at least admitted Israeli strikes in Syria over the last 18 months, Russia sort of turns a blind eye. Is this likely to change that in any way?
Well, I don't think so, because you saw what Vladimir Putin has said after all these very strong statements by the defense ministry, which said that Israel has deliberately put Russian plane into crossfire. And then Putin came up and said that it was actually just a tragic chain of events. And it seems that Putin really needs Israel to be involved in Syria to deter Iran and deter Syria, because even though Russia is friends with Syria and Iran, they still want them to be in check, to be under control. So I think Russia needs Israel, and it also needs Israel for its Russia-U.S. relations, because Israel is kind of a link for Russia with the U.S.
General Shafir, let's talk about what we just heard from I-24 News senior international affairs correspondent Owen Alterman. He said that even though Russia is now walking back its initial anger, it still needs to express its anger in some way. What are we expecting?
I think the Russians are going to vent off for a little while. They need to look like they're the bosses in Syria, which is quite true, and let the other players understand that they need to make sure that Russians are not involved. In this particular case, the first thing that they put out was that Israel had let the Russians know of the attack 1 minute before it took place, okay? But that was about half hour before the Russian plane was shot down. The Russian plane was shot down after the Israeli planes landed in their base in Israel. So there was a lag of time. So even though, yes, 1 minute, but the Russian plane wasn't there at that time. So it's obviously a problem of communication between the Russians and the Syrian air defense systems. Having said that, perhaps they cannot control the quality of the Syrians and their air defense systems. The Syrians had fired a lot of missiles that night at Israeli airplanes, and they were not aware that the Israeli planes, that plane is not an Israeli plane. They just shot him out of the sky.
This all happened within the space of, what, about 5 to 10 minutes, really showing...
No, 20 to 30 minutes.
20 to 30 minutes, yes. Showing how volatile this region is, that kind of chain of events, this many players involved. Take us through a little bit of what the process looks like between Israel and Russia in those skies. What does Israel do to let Russia know, to try to avoid cases exactly like this?
Okay, the Israeli planes take off. Once they take off from their bases, the Russians know that they're coming, and they are seeing them hovering above, flying above, and firing their weapon systems at the Iranian plant in that particular case. The fact is that the Russians, who know what's going on and they know where their plane is, are not in connection with the Syrian command. So the chain of events are that the Russians are aware of what is taking place, but they're not aware of what the SA-5s, the S-200, the Syrians are using, what their aerial picture is. So that is, understandably, they have to take that into account and probably put in new rules having a larger time space of Israel having to let them know that they are going to be operative in that area. Now, Israel has an interest because the Iranians had moved their plant very close to the Russian air bases so that they are under the umbrella of the Russians, so to speak. And actually, this plays into their hands. Obviously, the Russians are not going to let the Iranians too much latitude either. So there's probably going to be some new rules of engagement, and I would suggest that it will take a week or two for the dust to settle down.
Ivan, could this possibly push Vladimir Putin to push the Iranians out of some parts of Syria, which is something that he has not been open to up until this point?
Well, the problem is very complex. It's not just about Iran moving away from some parts of Syria. I mean, clearly Israel wants Iran to be away from Syria altogether, and I think Putin and Russia have offered to push Iran away by 100 kilometers away from Israel, but I don't think this is enough. So Russia wants to keep all players kind of at hand, at arm's length. Russia doesn't want to give everybody everything they want, so that this kind of situation continues, and Russia remains to be the ultimate broker of what this ultimate settlement is going to be. You know that, and you've mentioned that in your report, that Vladimir Putin and the Turkish President Erdogan signed what they want to be a breakthrough agreement on Idlib. So I think for Russia, the successful execution of this agreement is the most important priority right now.
Relik, part of the bigger picture here, you just mentioned Iran before, is Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Shiite militia. We heard Hassan Nasrallah just earlier in the show saying today that they have precision missiles, that Israel has really failed to stop the Hezbollah and Iranian threat. How far has Israel gone at stopping that threat, and how much do they need Russia on board to keep doing it going forward?
Well, obviously, the Russians are the bosses in the area, and just like in the Old West, when the sheriff comes into town, sometimes he just shoots to make sure that everybody understands who's the boss. So they're the big bear. They are in control. Everybody play by the rules. Hezbollah, obviously, is trying to use this particular incident to drive a wedge and up their position in the game. This is a multiplayer game. So every weakness in every indiscretion type of is being taken advantage of by the different players. They're being answered. So this kind of a conversation is just above the table. I would not take it too seriously on either side. It's a game of leverage and power, and this is what we should look at, not at what they're saying.
I wouldn't often say that Hassan Nasrallah is right, but in that speech he says the next war is going to look completely different. Israel estimates Hezbollah has between 100 and 200,000 missiles. Isn't he right that the game has changed?
Yes, but you can look at it in different ways. The Hezbollah has medium to small size missiles. The reason is that if larger missiles need larger infrastructure, they're easy to hit. So while they have a lot of missiles, these missiles have small warheads, which means that they can cause damage, but not strategic damage. And if you think about it, every country that has a military has missiles. And while Hezbollah has become a part of the Lebanese political infrastructure, they are responsible for the Lebanese infrastructure as well. So their latitude, rather than being a guerrilla in 2006 and before, now they're part of the government. So they have the responsibility. So that puts them under strain. But talking is cheap in the Middle East, and you should take it in that, I think, environment.
Ivan, we have about 30 seconds, but very quickly, tell me, does this possibly affect the future of the Israel-Russia relationship?
I don't think so. I think the relationship has very solid fundamentals, which is based on also on Putin's personal affinity to Israel and also on the historic ties on the diaspora. So I think it's a very minor nuisance that is going to be forgotten very soon.
All right, that's a testament to what this overall situation looks like when a plane being down with 15 people killed is a minor nuisance. Ivan Nechepurenko in Moscow.
Allow me to remind you, in 1967, Israeli planes had bombed a U.S. spy or intelligence ship called the Liberty, killing a lot of people on board. And that was the type of incident we're looking at now. These are tactical mishaps, and I wouldn't confuse that with strategic interests.
All right, maybe a footnote in history, what seemed like a big deal at the time. Brigadier General Relik Shafir.